The needle on the pressure gauge was stuck. I noticed it right as the docking clamp released and the shuttle lurched forward into the Vrethian approach corridor, and I remember thinking that if the gauge was lying to me, I had about 4 minutes before the port thruster failed, and I spent my last moments spinning into a blue-white gas giant. I did not panic. I reached under the console, tapped the gauge housing twice with my knuckle, and the needle jumped back to normal. That was the kind of problem I was good at solving. Simple, mechanical, fixable. What waited for me on the other side of that docking bay was not a problem I was good at solving, and I did not know that yet, which was probably the only reason I survived the next 6 hours. My name is Cale Doran. My rank, at the time, was Specialist, which is the diplomatic service's polite way of saying you are useful enough to keep employed, but not important enough to give a title. I carried a sealed case with a biometric lock keyed to my left thumb. The case contained treaty amendments between the Terran Diplomatic Corps and the Vrethian Imperium, 7 pages of dense legal language that 3 ambassadors had spent 2 years arguing over. I was not supposed to be the one delivering it. Senior Attaché Owen Garth was supposed to make this run. Owen had collapsed in the transit lounge on Helix Station, 40 hours earlier, with what the station medic called a severe inner ear rupture. Owen could not walk in a straight line. Owen could not be trusted to bow at the correct angle, in front of an emperor, let alone stand upright long enough to do it. So they sent me. The briefing was 11 minutes long. A woman named Petra Hollis, who ran logistics for the Corps on Helix Station, sat across from me with a cup of something hot and read from a screen without once looking up. She told me the name of the emperor. She told me the name of the hall where I would present the case. She told me to bow at 45 degrees upon entering, not to speak until spoken to, and under no circumstances to make direct eye contact with any member of the Royal Guard. She told me the Vrathians considered direct eye contact from an outsider to be a challenge to personal honor. She told me to keep my hands visible at all times, to walk slowly, and to let the escort guide me. Then she closed her screen and said, "Don't make this complicated, Doran." I said I wouldn't. I believed myself when I said it. The docking bay on the Imperial Station Vreth car smelled like copper, and something sweet I could not identify, a kind of warm floral scent that came from the vented atmosphere processors. The gravity was slightly higher than Earth standard, maybe 1.1, enough that my shoulders felt heavier than usual, but not enough to slow me down. 2 Vrethian attendants in pale gray robes met me at the airlock. They were tall. All Vrethians are tall, nearly 2.5 meters, with narrow frames and 6-fingered hands, and faces that remind you faintly of long-boned birds, though saying so out loud is considered extremely rude. One of them held a flat stone tablet with markings I could not read. The other gestured for me to follow. I followed. The station was enormous. The corridors were wide enough to drive vehicles through, and the ceilings arched so far overhead that the light at the top edge looked slightly dimmer than at eye level. Everything was carved from something pale and smooth, not quite stone, not quite metal, and the floors had a faint warmth to them like heated tiles. There were other beings moving through the corridors, robed officials, armored guards with long spears that were clearly ceremonial, and clearly also functional, small automated units rolling along the wall edges, and twice, groups of beings from species I did not recognize who glanced at me with expressions I could not read. I kept my eyes forward. I kept my hands visible. I walked slowly. The attendant in front stopped at an intersection and turned left. I turned left. Then he stopped again, consulted the tablet, and turned back the way we had come. We retraced our steps. He stopped, spoke quickly to the other attendant in Vrethian, a language that sounds like someone playing a pipe instrument very fast and slightly out of tune, and then they both looked at the tablet again. I understood then that they were lost, or rather, they were recalibrating, which is the polite version of lost. I waited. I had no choice but to wait. After about 90 seconds, one of them pointed ahead and to the right, toward a wide archway that I had walked past twice already. Beyond it, I could see a long hall with light pouring in from high windows. The attendant gestured me forward. I walked forward. What I did not know, because no one told me, Because Petra Hollis's 11-minute briefing had covered the name of the hall and the angle of my bow but not the layout of the station, was that the archway they pointed me through was not the petitioner's queue entrance. It was the Hall of Approach, which is the direct processional route used exclusively by individuals of the highest imperial rank. 3 security checkpoints operated along the Hall of Approach. They were not checkpoints in the way I understood them. No scanners or ID terminals. They were guards positioned at intervals whose entire function was to observe and confirm that the person walking toward them had already been confirmed by the previous guard. I did not know any of this. I walked through the archway, and I kept walking. The first pair of guards watched me approach. They were in full ceremonial armor, a deep blue-black with gold trim, and they held their spears at a particular angle that I did not know meant cleared for passage. When I reached them, I nodded. Not a formal bow, just the kind of nod you give to someone when you pass them in a corridor at work. They did not stop me. They moved their spears to the other angle, which I also did not know was the signal to the next pair of guards. So the next pair already knew I was cleared before I reached them. I nodded at them too. They moved their spears. The third pair at the end of the hall did the same. I walked through all 3 checkpoints in under 4 minutes without being stopped once. Beyond the third checkpoint, the hall opened into a chamber so large that my first thought was that there had been a mistake in the building plans. It was enormous. The ceiling was at least 60 meters overhead. The walls were covered in tapestries that stretched from floor to ceiling, depicting scenes I could not interpret, but which involved a great many dramatic poses and what appeared to be multiple suns. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, and my boots made a sound with every step that seemed to carry to every corner of the room. There were people here, dozens of them, officials in layered robes standing in arranged positions, and every single one of them turned to look at me when I entered. They went still in a way that reminded me of the moment before a storm breaks, that brief held breath quiet when the air changes. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform with wide steps leading up to it, sat the Emperor of the Vrethian Imperium. His name was Voth, and I knew that from my briefing, and he was the only one in the room who did not turn to look at me when I walked in. He was looking at something to his left, a document being held by an attendant, and he was reading it. He had a long face, pale silver-gray skin, and hair that had been built upward into an elaborate structure, held by what appeared to be thin pins of dark metal. He wore a robe that covered his entire frame and pooled slightly on the platform around him. He looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, and would continue sitting there for a long time, and was not particularly surprised by anything the universe might decide to do next. I walked to the base of the steps. I stopped. I remembered the bow. 45 degrees. Petra Hollis had been very clear about 45 degrees. I bowed. I held it for what I hoped was the right length of time, straightened and said, "Good afternoon. I'm Specialist Kale Doran, Terran Diplomatic Corps. I'm here on behalf of Senior Attaché Owen Garth, who is unwell. I have the amended treaty documents." I held up the case. The room did not breathe. The Emperor finished reading whatever he had been reading. He handed the document back to the attendant. He turned to look at me. His eyes were amber, almost orange, and they were very steady. He looked at me the way you look at something when you are trying to figure out what it is. "You entered through the Hall of Approach," he said. His galactic standard was perfect. No accent, or rather, an accent that was so precise it no longer sounded like one. "I believe so," I said. "Your attendants directed me. Through 3 checkpoints. There were guards at intervals, yes. And they did not stop you." I looked at the case in my hand. No, they didn't. The Emperor was quiet for a moment. Everyone in the room was quiet. I became aware, in the specific sharpening way that the human nervous system communicates important information under pressure, that I had done something significant. I did not know what it was. I knew it was significant in the same way you know the pressure gauge is wrong before you understand why. Something in the numbers that does not add up. "That hall," the Emperor said slowly, "has not been walked by anyone below the rank of Imperial Commander since my grandfather's time." I thought about this. I didn't know that. I assumed as much. He paused again. You are replacing Owen Garth? Yes. Is Garth expected to recover? The medic said 2 to 3 weeks. And they sent you. They sent me, I confirmed. He studied me for another few seconds. Then he said something to the room in Vrethian, the pipe music language, sharp and fast, and the room moved. Every official, every robed figure, every attendant stepped back toward the walls and stood there. Every guard except 4, who moved to positions at the corners of the platform, left through side doors I had not noticed. The room, which had been full of people, became very nearly empty in about 30 seconds. The Emperor rose from his seat and walked down the steps until he was standing on the floor level, about 3 meters from me. Up close he was even taller than I had estimated, nearly 2 meters 70, and he looked down at me with that same steady amber gaze. "Give me the case," he said. I held it out. He pressed 2 of his long fingers to the lock housing and waited. I pressed my thumb to it. The lock clicked. He took the case. He did not open it immediately. He held it in both hands and looked at me for a long moment. And then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said it quietly, the way people say things they have already decided about, but want to hear spoken out loud. "You walked where my generals kneel," he said. "I would very much like to know why." I opened my mouth to say that I had simply followed the attendants, that I had not known, that it was an error in navigation that anyone could have made. I almost said it. The words were right there, simple and true, and completely accurate. I did not say them. Not because I was being clever, not because I was calculating some advantage. I did not say them because in that specific moment, standing on a mirror-bright floor under a 60-meter ceiling, with 40 armed guards looking at me from the edges of the room, with an emperor standing 3 meters away holding a case that had locked to my thumbprint, I made the most human error available to me. I hesitated. And in the gap between his question and my answer, the room decided that my silence meant something. I could see it happening, the slight shift in posture from the guards at the corners, the quality of the quiet that settled over the chamber like something that had been waiting. They were reading my silence the way you read a map, looking for landmarks, finding meanings I had not put there. I said, "I'm happy to explain." The Emperor's expression did not change. But something behind his eyes did, some small movement of interest that pulled inward rather than outward, like a door opening onto a room you had not known was there. "I would appreciate that," he said. He turned and walked back up the steps and sat down. He placed the case on his knee and waited. I stood at the base of the steps, case delivered, mission technically complete, and thought about exactly how to explain that I had walked through his most sacred ceremonial corridor because 2 robed attendants had been looking at a tablet and gone the wrong way. I thought about how to say that in a manner that was honest without being, in some way I could not fully define, the wrong kind of honest. Behind me, faintly, I heard the sound of armor shifting. I glanced back, just quickly, and saw that the guards at the corners had moved. They had moved forward. Not toward me, not exactly. They had moved into a position that, if I had known Vrethian court protocol, I would have recognized as a formation reserved for when someone of significance was addressing the throne. They had surrounded me in the loosest possible sense, not blocking, not threatening, flanking, protective. I turned back to the Emperor. "It was the attendants," I said. "They weren't sure of the route. They guided me through the closest open archway. I didn't know it was the hall of approach." The Emperor looked at me for a very long time. "That is what you choose to say," he said. "Not a question, not agreement. An observation, careful and precise, the kind of thing someone says when they are giving you credit for something they believe you have done deliberately." "It's what happened," I said. "Yes," he said. "I believe you." He paused. "Which makes it more interesting, not less." He opened the case. He began to read. I stood at the base of the steps of the imperial throne, in a room that had gone completely silent, and tried to remember if Petra Hollis had said anything about what to do next. She had not. It was going to be a long assignment. By the time I got back to the embassy quarter that evening, Someone had given me a guest suite on the third tier of the Imperial residential wing. This was, as the embassy's communications officer, Lena Voss, explained to me over a crackling signal, extremely unusual. Lena had been stationed on Vreth Kar for 2 years and had never been above the second tier. I told her I was sure it was just a courtesy. She said it was not just a courtesy and asked me 4 times what exactly I had said to the Emperor. I told her about the Hall of Approach. The line went quiet. Then she said, "Kale, that hall has a name." I asked what the name meant. She said it translated roughly to the path of those who cannot be stopped. I told her that seemed dramatic. She said that on Vreth Kar, dramatic was the baseline. I sat on the edge of the bed in the suite and ate a nutrition block from my bag because I had not been offered food and had not known how to ask, and I pulled up every piece of publicly available information I could find on the Vrethian Imperium on my personal reader. I read for 3 hours. I learned things that Petra Hollis had not mentioned. I learned that the first human ambassador to Vreth Kar, a man named Garrett Cole, had died during a formal reception ceremony when the hall temperature exceeded what a human body could manage. He had stood through the entire ceremony without any visible sign of distress, and then died quietly 4 minutes after it ended. The Vrethian record of the event described him as having endured the trial of the burning hall without expression or retreat. There was no trial of the burning hall. It was a standard reception. Garrett Cole had simply not wanted to make a scene, and then his body had stopped working, and in the space between those 2 facts, a legend had been born. I also found references to something called the Unmarked, a concept in Vrethian military tradition that I had to read 3 times before I understood it. The Vrethians, like many civilizations organized around hierarchy, placed enormous importance on insignia. Rank was visible. Authority was displayed. Everyone knew where everyone stood because they could look at them and read it like a sign. The Unmarked were a different kind of problem. They appeared in Vrethian histories as rare individuals who carried no visible insignia but around whom systems of order seemed to reorganize themselves. They were not common. They were not mythological exactly, but they were written about with a specific tone reserved for things that people want to explain but cannot quite manage. I read about one case from a century earlier in which a visitor to the court who carried no mark of rank had been followed out of the palace by 17 members of the royal guard who insisted they had received orders from him. The visitor had given no orders. He had simply walked out. I put my reader down and looked at the ceiling of the guest suite, which was high and pale and carved with a pattern of overlapping geometric shapes that I could not stop seeing as incomplete equations. I thought about the Hall of Approach. I thought about the guards who had nodded me through. I thought about the Emperor's face when he said it was more interesting, not less. I thought about how a thing becomes a story, not the way it actually happens, not the chain of small accidents and wrong turns and navigation errors that produce a moment, but the story that gets told afterward, by people who were not there but who need the moment to mean something. Garrett Cole had not been heroic. He had been polite and then unfortunate. But the story of a man who stands unmoved while the world burns around him, that story was useful. It fit into spaces that the other kind of story could not fill. I was not Garrett Cole. I had not endured anything. I had walked through an archway that 2 confused attendants pointed me toward. I had not known about the checkpoints. I had not known about the guards. I had said nothing impressive to the Emperor. I had told the truth. And the truth had been interpreted as something else entirely. I told myself that in the morning I would find the right official, the right interpreter, the right level of bureaucratic authority, and I would clarify the situation. I would explain that the Hall of Approach was a routing error. I would correct the record before it became the wrong kind of record. I was going to be here for weeks, standing in for Owen Garth while he recovered his sense of balance on Helix Station. And I needed the people around me to understand what I actually was, which was a mid-level logistics specialist who was good at reading situations and not good at being a legend. I fell asleep with that plan clear in my mind. It was, in retrospect, one of the last moments of that trip when things were simple. I woke at what my reader said was early station morning to a sound outside my door. Not a knock, a presence, the particular stillness of someone standing near something. the way the air behaves differently when a space is occupied. I got up, crossed to the door, and opened it. There were 2 members of the Royal Guard in the corridor. They were in full armor, the blue, black, and gold I had seen in the Hall of Approach. They were not standing in front of my door exactly. They were standing about 3 meters down the corridor, 1 on each side, and they were looking forward, not at me. When I opened the door, they did not react. They did not look at me. They simply continued to stand there, the way guards stand when they are guarding something. I looked at them for a moment. I looked down the corridor in both directions. There were no other doors being guarded. There were no other visible guests on this section of the tier. I thought about asking them something, then remembered the briefing about direct eye contact and thought better of it. I closed the door. I stood in the middle of the room. Someone had assigned members of the Royal Guard to stand outside my door overnight. This was not something that happened to couriers. This was not something that happened to specialists. This was something that happened to people who warranted a level of protection, or surveillance, that required the actual Royal Guard, and not the standard station security units that I had seen monitoring other residential tiers. I sat back down on the bed. I ate the second nutrition block from my bag. I revised my plan. The plan was no longer about clarifying the record first thing in the morning. The plan was about understanding exactly how wrong the record had already gotten before I started trying to fix it. Because fixing the wrong thing could be more dangerous than the original mistake. This was a principle I had learned in logistics work. You do not reroute a shipment without first understanding the full network. You do not correct a manifest without knowing what the manifest is connected to. You find the shape of the error before you start repairing it, because sometimes the error is the only thing holding the system together. I did not know how far the story had already traveled. I did not know who had told it, or what they had added, or what version of Kael'doran was now circulating through the corridors and reception rooms and secure channels of the Vrethian Imperial Court. I needed to know that before I did anything, because if I walked into the right official's office tomorrow morning and said I was not the unmarked courier who had walked the path of those who cannot be stopped, and held the Emperor's attention for 20 silent seconds, I needed to know exactly what I was replacing that story with. I opened my reader again. I pulled up everything I could find about the Vrethian court's internal communication systems, and what the Vrethians called the language of position, which was not a spoken language but a system of behavioral signals, posture, pace, silence, direction of gaze, that communicated status and intention to anyone trained to read it. I read until the station lights shifted from their low overnight setting to the warm gold of morning, and I learned 3 things that changed everything. The first was that my nod to the guards in the Hall of Approach, the informal corridor nod I had given them without thinking, was in Vrethian body language, a gesture of peer acknowledgement. Not deference, not greeting. Peer acknowledgement. I had acknowledged 3 sets of Royal Guard as my equals. The second was that in the Vrethian tradition, when a being of unknown rank acknowledges the guard as peers, the guard is bound by protocol to return the acknowledgement, which they had done by moving their spears to the cleared passage position. They had not cleared me because they were confused. They had cleared me because I had told them, without words, that we were on the same level, and the protocol had taken over from there. The third thing I learned was that the behavioral sequence I had completed without knowing it, the peer acknowledgement of the guard, followed by unescorted direct approach to the throne, followed by deliberate, controlled silence in response to the Emperor's question, had a name in the Vrethian tradition. It was the approach pattern of the unmarked. It had been documented 3 times in recorded Vrethian history. On all 3 occasions, the individual in question had turned out to be someone of enormous actual authority, traveling deliberately without insignia, hiding their power in plain sight. I put the reader down on the bed beside me. I looked at the door. Outside, 2 members of the Royal Guard stood in the corridor, looking forward, waiting. I had not created this situation on purpose. I had not planned any of it. Every element of what they were reading as calculated authority had been genuine accident, wrong turns and instinct, and a nod I had not thought twice about. I was a specialist. I was filling in for a man with an inner ear rupture. I had eaten 2 nutrition blocks in the last 18 hours, and I had not been offered coffee. But I also understood, sitting there in that carved and geometric room on the third tier of an imperial residential wing, that what mattered was not the truth of what had happened. What mattered was the shape of the story. And the shape of the story was already very specific. And it had the royal guard of the Vrethian Imperium standing outside my door at morning's first light, and the Emperor of the Vrethian Imperium waiting to see what I would do next. I stood up. I put on my uniform. I checked that the case was logged as delivered in my mission record, which it was. I added a brief note. Route deviation on approach to throne room, with further details pending. I tied my boots. I ran a hand over my face and thought about how my mother had always said I had a face that people found difficult to read. Not because I was mysterious, but because I was always slightly more interested in the problem than the emotion, and she meant it as a mild criticism, but I had always taken it as a compliment. I opened the door. The two guards were still there. They turned to face forward when I stepped into the corridor, moving in perfect synchronization, one on each side, half a step behind me. Not blocking, not escorting in the formal sense, following, at the distance that Vrethian military tradition reserved for beings of significant authority. I walked down the corridor toward the morning. I did not know where I was going exactly. I knew the shape of the problem. I knew what I had walked into, and I knew that walking back out of it was going to require a great deal more care than walking in had. Because walking in had required no care at all, only an attendant with a bad sense of direction, and a pressure gauge that needed 2 taps to start working again. Behind me, footsteps followed mine in measured rhythm, 2 members of the Royal Guard of the Vrethian Imperium, accompanying a courier with no rank, no insignia, no plan, and a growing suspicion that the next few weeks were going to be extremely complicated. I kept walking. That, at least, I knew how to do. I found out exactly how far the story had traveled on the morning of my 3rd day, when Commander Sarath walked up to me in the corridor outside the Eastern Documentation Hall, stopped 2 meters away, and bowed. Not the shallow courtesy bow of a social greeting, the bow with the spine fully inclined and the hands flat at the sides, the one that in Vrethian protocol was reserved for addressing a superior. Commander Sarath was 6'8", broad across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than the station walls, and he outranked nearly everyone on Vrethkar below the Emperor himself. He bowed to me like I was a problem he respected. I said, "Please don't do that." He straightened. "You prefer the informal address?" "I prefer not to be bowed at by someone who could probably lift me over his head." He regarded me with a steady expression that I was beginning to recognize as the Vrethian equivalent of very carefully suppressed amusement. "You are Doran," he said. "K.L. Doran, specialist. I was sent to deliver a document." I was getting used to saying this. I had said some version of it 4 times in 3 days. It had not stopped anything from happening. "I am aware of your delivery," he said. "I am here on a different matter." He reached into a flat case he carried under one arm and produced a card printed with symbols I did not know. "I request your guidance on the matter of the sealed passage." I took the card. I looked at it. The symbols were in Vrethian script, which I could not read. "Can you tell me what this refers to?" I asked. "The sealed passage," he said, "connects the northeastern guard quarters to the secondary Imperial approach hall. It has been under dispute for 9 months between 2 factions within the guard. The Emperor has not ruled. It has been suggested," he paused very briefly, "that your perspective may be valuable." I held the card with both hands and looked at it the way you look at things when you are thinking, which in my case usually looks like I am about to solve something. I was not about to solve anything. I was trying to understand what he was asking me, without revealing that I did not know what he was asking me. There was a very fine line between asking for clarification and shattering the entire constructed image of a person who walks the path of those who cannot be stopped. And I was standing on that line. "I'll need the full report," I said. "Both sides of the dispute. Primary documentation, not summaries." Sarath nodded. "By this afternoon." "Good," I said. "Thank you, Commander." He bowed again, shorter this time, the peer acknowledgement bow, and walked away down the corridor. I watched him go. Then I went back to my suite and immediately wrote out everything I remembered about dispute resolution protocols from the 2 years I had spent processing cargo grievances between 3 competing freight guilds on the Helix route. It was not the same thing. It was also more than nothing. The full report arrived at my door at mid-afternoon, delivered by a junior guard, who handed me a stack of documents, and then stepped back to the guard position in the corridor without speaking. The documents were in Vrethian script. All of them. I sat with them for 40 minutes before I accepted that I needed a translator and sent a message through the embassy channel to Lena Voss, who arranged one within the hour. A young Vrethian civilian named Osa who worked as a cultural liaison and spoke Galactic Standard with only a slight musical lilt. Osa read me the documents. The dispute, as far as I could understand it, was about access rights to a corridor that both the Northern and Southern Guard factions had used for generations, and which had become contested after a boundary revision 9 months earlier, that both sides interpreted differently. It was, under the specific language and tradition and elaborate ceremony, a disagreement about a hallway. It was the same argument I had mediated 14 times between freight companies, and the resolution was always the same: shared calendar rights with a rotating priority system, verified by a neutral record, reviewed quarterly. I wrote this up in plain language. I did not make it sound complicated. I sent it to Sarath through the guard's internal channel with a note that said, "This is a straightforward shared access arrangement. The details can be formalized by your legal staff. I recommend a trial period of 60 days before permanent designation." The response came back in under 3 hours. 2 words. As directed. I read those 2 words and sat with them for a while. Then I wrote in my mission log, "Mediated internal guard corridor dispute. Solution applied standard freight routing principles. Outcome, accepted." It was the driest sentence I had ever written, and it covered, I suspected, one of the stranger afternoons of my career. The story, I was learning, fed itself. Every small thing I did that could be interpreted as deliberate was interpreted as deliberate. My silence was strategic. My plain language was cryptic understatement. When I asked for the full report instead of the summary, it was because I trusted no one else's reading of the facts. When I recommended a trial period of 60 days, it was because I was testing something. I was not testing anything. 60 days was the standard period in freight dispute resolution. I used it because I knew it worked. But I was beginning to understand the mechanism, and understanding a mechanism is the first step toward deciding what to do with it. On the 5th day, I met Lord Drevak. He found me at morning meal in the communal dining hall on the 3rd tier, which I had started using because it was the only place where food was reliably available, and I had eaten enough nutrition blocks to last a lifetime. He sat down across from me uninvited, which was already unusual, set a cup of something steaming on the table between us, and looked at me with the specific expression of a person who has already decided they do not like you, but wants to get a good look first. Drevak was tall in the way all Vrethians were tall, but also carried an additional quality of taking up space that had nothing to do with his physical size. He had dark silver skin, and his insignia, which covered the left shoulder of his formal robe, was complex and heavily layered. I had enough Vrethian social education by that point to know that a complex insignia meant very old lineage, serious political weight, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong in a room that had the power to correct him. "You are the human," he said. "I am a human," I said. "You came through the hall of approach." "I did. The attendants who guided you have been reassigned." I stopped eating. "Were they punished?" "Reassigned," he said again. "To quieter posts." He picked up his cup. "Do you feel responsible for that?" "I feel that it was an honest navigational error, and the outcome seems disproportionate to the cause." He watched me over the rim of his cup. "You speak plainly. I find that useful. Many in this court find your manner unsettling. I can work on that if it would help." He set the cup down. "I have been in this court for 30 years, he said. "I have seen 11 ambassadors from your species. You are the first to arrive without a rank marker of any kind." I'm a courier. Couriers don't typically carry rank markers. You are not behaving like a courier. I'm doing my best, I said, which was true. It was also apparently the wrong thing to say, or the right thing said in the wrong tone, because his expression shifted into something harder and more certain. There is a tradition, he said, when a being of unknown status appears in this court, the right of disclosure. I had read about this. I had read about this specifically because Lena Voss had flagged it in her third message to me as something I should know existed. The right of disclosure required an individual of unknown rank to formally recite their lineage and deeds before the assembled court, so that their status could be assessed and their position in the social hierarchy established. It was, in the simplest terms, the court's way of making sure everyone was labeled correctly. I'm aware of the right, I said. Then you know you have one cycle to prepare. Is this a formal invocation? He picked up his cup again and stood. It is a request, he said, from a concerned member of the court. And if I decline? He looked at me with that hard, certain expression. You won't, he said, and then he left. I sat with my food for another minute, eating steadily, thinking about Garrett Cole and the burning hall, and the way stories form around the spaces where facts run out. Then I went back to my suite and opened my mission log and pulled up my actual service record, because that was what the right of disclosure required, and that was what I was going to bring. I did not embellish it. I did not reframe it. I read it carefully and found that it contained, in 7 years of service, the following: 4 commendations for accurate manifest filing, 2 citations for problem resolution in cargo disputes, 1 incident report involving a thruster gauge that I had tapped twice and fixed, a performance review describing me as reliable and methodical, and a note from a previous supervisor that said, Doran gets the job done without making it about himself, which is rarer than it should be. I printed all of it, I folded it, I put it in my jacket pocket. The morning of the right of disclosure arrived with what felt like unnecessary speed. The hall they used for it was smaller than the throne room, but still very large, and it was full. Every court official who could arrange to be present was present. I counted, roughly, 200 people arranged in a semicircle around a small raised circle of floor, where I was supposed to stand and speak. Lord Drevak was present, standing at the front of the semicircle with his layered insignia on full display. Commander Sarath was there too, in full guard armor, standing to one side. I could not read his expression. I stepped into the circle. I took out the folded papers. I read from them in a steady, clear voice, in Galactic Standard, with Osa providing quiet simultaneous translation into Vrethian, through a small transmitter clipped to my collar. I read the commendations for manifest filing. I read the cargo dispute resolutions. I read the note about the thruster gauge. I read the performance review. I read every single line of it, and I read it the way I read everything. Not performing, not embellishing, just delivering the information in the order it appeared. My voice did not rise or fall dramatically. I did not pause for effect. I finished reading, folded the papers back along their creases, put them in my pocket, and looked up. The silence in the room was not the silence of boredom. It was the silence of people working very hard to make something fit. 200 Vrethian court officials were looking at me and listening to a translation of a service record that contained cargo manifests and a broken thruster gauge, and they were trying to understand what it meant for a being of this power to speak of such things in such a tone. Lena Voss told me later what the court scribe had written in the official record of the right. She said it was the most unsettling thing she had read in 2 years on Vrethkar. The scribe had written, "The being Doran catalogued victories in the language of the dead, without heat or color. He carried his record as a predator carries its silence. Those present were reminded of old stone and deep water." I had read my manifest commendations out loud. Someone had decided it was a portrait of a predator at rest. Lord Drevak waited until I was almost to the door of the hall before he spoke. He said it loudly, into the silence that still held the room, and every person present heard it. He said, "A right of disclosure requires proof of martial standing. Doran has shown us records of freight. I challenge him to a blade contest, as is my right." I stopped walking. I turned. Drevak was standing where he had been, arms at his sides, watching me. I did not know Vrethian blade contest protocol. I knew that I had basic military conditioning from the standard diplomatic service training program, which included 12 hours of defensive techniques and a written exam. I did not know how to fight a 2.5-meter Vrethian noble who had probably been training since childhood. I did not want to fight a 2.5-meter Vrethian noble. I had very specific and well-grounded reasons for not wanting to do this. I looked at Drevak for a moment, then I said, "No." Just that. No explanation, no apology. No. The room went into a different kind of silence. Not the silence of interpretation this time. The silence of a rule being referenced that most people in the room knew, but had never seen activated. Commander Sarath's voice came from the side of the room, steady and formal. He spoke in Vrethian, and Osa's translation came through my earpiece a second later. A challenge issued without standing is void. The challenger must hold equivalent or superior demonstrated rank to invoke martial right. Lord Drevak has not established equivalence. I did not fully understand this. I understood enough to know that Sarath had just said that Drevak's challenge was legally improper under Vrethian tradition. The room understood it completely. Every person there understood exactly what it meant. Drevak's challenge had been refused, not because I could not answer it, but because he had not earned the right to issue it. Drevak went very still. Then he turned and walked out of a side door without another word. I walked out of the main door. Sarath fell into step beside me in the corridor outside, his armor making a soft, constant sound as he moved. "He'll be removed from active court attendance," Sarath said quietly. "A public improper challenge is a serious matter." "I didn't know that would happen," I said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "The guard knows you let him proceed to that point. You could have stopped it earlier." I looked at him. "How would I have stopped it earlier?" "You could have signaled your legal standing before the rite began. You chose not to." I had not chosen not to. I had simply not known how. But I saw how it looked. I saw the story assembling itself again, the same mechanism, the same gap between fact and interpretation. "What does the guard think that means?" I asked. "That you gave him enough space to make his own error," Sarath said. "That is, in our tradition, a mercy." I thought about saying that mercy was not what I had been doing. I thought about saying that I had been doing the best I could with incomplete information, in a situation I had not been trained for. I thought about how many times I had said some version of that in 5 days and how little it had changed anything. "Sure," I said instead. Sarath made a sound that, through what I now understood of Vrethian tone and register, was very close to a laugh. He did not stop walking, but for just a moment, the careful gravity of his expression shifted, and I thought I saw something beneath it, something older and more direct than the formal commander of the Royal Guard, something that looked at me and saw not a legend, but a person, tired and careful and doing his best, and found that also worth his interest. I filed it away. I was learning to file things away on Vrethkar, because everything was information, and information was the only thing I actually had. The corridor where I nearly got myself seriously hurt was on the 7th level of the station, in a section labeled on the station map as Administrative Archive West, which is the kind of name designed to make people look elsewhere. I had gone there because Osa had mentioned, in passing, that the original boundary survey documents for the sealed passage dispute were kept in Administrative Archive West, and I had decided that since I had technically resolved the dispute, I should probably understand what I had resolved. It was the kind of due diligence that my previous supervisors had always praised. It was also, that evening, almost the last decision I ever made. The corridor was narrow by Vrethian standards, which still made it wide by mine. The overhead lighting was on its low evening setting. I was carrying my reader and a cup of the warm pressed grain drink I had discovered on the 3rd tier that was the closest thing available to coffee, and I was thinking about boundary survey language, and not about anything else, when the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and 3 figures came through it, moving in a way that had nothing to do with routine movement. I know the difference between someone walking with purpose and someone moving towards something. I learned it in freight yards, where the tone of a space changes before anything happens, where the air carries intention the same way it carries temperature. These three were moving toward something. The something was me. I did not run. Running was not useful in a corridor with one exit point behind me, and three figures between me and the far end. I also did not stand still, because standing still in a narrow corridor, when someone is moving toward you with intent, removes all your options at once. I moved to the right side of the corridor, close to the wall, which narrowed their approach angle from 3 wide to 1 at a time, and I set the cup down on a ledge without looking away from them, and I held my reader in both hands. They were Vrethian, tall the way all Vrethians were tall, and they were not in any uniform I recognized, which meant they were not official guards and were probably not authorized to be in this section. One of them was holding something at his side that caught the low light the way metal catches light. I could not see the other two's hands. The one in front said something in Vrethian. My earpiece had Asa's translation function, but Asa had gone home for the evening, and the automatic translation was slow. I got the word passage, and the word human, and something that might have been close, or might have been end. I said, I don't want trouble. He took another step forward. Human low-light vision is not better than Vrethian low-light vision in absolute terms. But human threat response under low light has a specific characteristic that does not apply to most species, which is that it removes the hesitation layer. In sufficient danger with insufficient visual information, a human nervous system stops calculating and starts acting, and the action comes before the conscious decision, which means it is faster than anything based on deliberate choice. The first figure moved. I moved faster. Not skillfully, not with any trained technique. I stepped toward him rather than back, which he did not expect, and I used the reader as an extension of my arm to block the metal object coming at me. And the impact sent the reader flying but also sent his arm wide. And then I was past him, and moving toward the far door, and the second figure grabbed at me but got my jacket collar rather than my arm, and the jacket tore, and I was through the grip and running, which was exactly what I had decided not to do 30 seconds earlier, but which became the correct decision the moment the geometry changed. The door at the far end was locked. I hit it with my shoulder, which did nothing useful except tell me it was locked, and I turned with my back to it, and looked at the three of them in the low corridor light. They were reorganizing. They were not moving fast. They were moving like people who had time, who had planned for the door at the far end to be locked, who knew the only other exit was behind them. Then the lights in the corridor came to full brightness, the sudden sharp white of emergency activation, and the door behind me opened, and the sound of boot steps came from everywhere at once, that specific synchronized rhythm I had been hearing for 5 days, and Commander Sereth was there with 8 members of the Royal Guard, and the 3 figures in the corridor went very still in the way that people go still when the calculation has resolved itself completely against them. I leaned against the now open door and breathed. My jacket was torn at the collar. I had a cut on my right forearm from the reader impact that I had not noticed until the adrenaline started to recede, and my hand was shaking slightly in the way hands do when the body has spent everything it had and is filing a complaint. I looked down at the cut. It was not deep. It was going to need cleaning and a bandage. I thought about this with the very specific focus of someone whose mind has narrowed to the practical, because the practical is manageable. Sereth crossed the corridor in 3 long strides and looked at my arm. His expression was something I had not seen from him before. Not the careful professional gravity, not the suppressed amusement. This was something more direct. "You're injured," he said. "It's minor," I said. "Cleaning and a bandage. You should not have been in this corridor alone. I know that now." He looked at me for a moment, and something in his face shifted. Something that had been held in a formal register moved into a plainer one. "The guard should have had this area covered. That is a failure on our part, not yours." "I was doing archive research," I said. "That shouldn't require a guard presence." "Here," he said quietly. "Everything requires a guard presence." He looked at the 3 figures now being held against the far wall. "They were sent," he said. "This was not random. I had figured as much." "By whom?" "We will determine that." He turned back to me. Can you walk? Yes. Then walk with me. We walked. 2 guards fell in behind us. The standard 4 behind pattern I had gotten used to. But Serath himself walked beside me this time, rather than a half step behind. And that, I had learned, meant something specific in Vrethian escort protocol. It meant peer-level accompaniment. It meant he was walking with me, not guarding me, which was a distinction that the whole language of position would communicate to anyone who saw us. We went to a small room off the main guard hall that I had not been in before, plain and functional, with a table and 4 chairs and a medical cabinet on the wall. A guard opened the cabinet and handed Serath a cleaning kit. Serath sat across from me at the table and cleaned the cut on my arm himself, efficiently and without ceremony. And I let him because arguing seemed beside the point. "How long have you known?" I asked. He did not look up from the arm. "Known what? That I'm not what they think I am. That I walked in through the wrong archway because the attendants got lost. That I had no idea what I was doing." He was quiet for a moment. He finished cleaning the cut and applied the bandage with 2 clean strips. Then he sat back and looked at me directly, not with the formal guard's gaze, but with his own. "I served alongside a human 23 years ago," he said, "on a joint security posting in the outer sectors. His name was Philip Crane. He was the most unremarkable-looking person I had ever seen. He wore no insignia because the posting required civilian cover. He did his job. He adapted to problems faster than anyone I had ever worked with, and he did it without performance, without announcement, without any of the things that in Vrethian tradition mark a person as significant." He paused. "I recognized what you were on the first morning." I looked at him. "And you didn't correct the record." "Philip Crane once told me something," Serath said. "He said that what made humans difficult to predict was not that they were strong or fast or brilliant, though some of them were. What made them difficult was that they could not be categorized. You put a human in a situation with no protocol, and no training, and no support, and they do not stop. They adapt. They find the principle underneath the situation, and they apply it. They walk through the wrong door, and bow at the wrong angle, and refuse a challenge they don't understand, and somehow the shape of their action is always coherent." He looked at the door, then back at me. I did not correct the record because the record, for once, was not entirely wrong. I thought about this. I thought about Philip Crane, whoever he was, walking through outer sector postings in civilian cover, doing his job without announcement. I thought about Garrett Cole standing in a burning hall until he couldn't anymore. I thought about the cargo disputes, and the manifest commendations, and the pressure gauge that needed 2 taps. I thought about what it meant to carry a principle through a situation, without knowing the situation, just the principle. "The Emperor knew," I said, "from the first day. You said the right was the first day you recognized me. But you said the Emperor knew." "Yes," Serath said. "How long has he known?" "From the moment you walked through the hall of approach," Serath said. "He has access to every feed, every log, every navigation record. He saw the attendants make the routing error. He knew exactly what had happened." He paused. He also chose to let the record develop. I sat with that. The Emperor, who read documents while the court stood waiting, who had watched me walk through 3 checkpoints by accident, and said it was more interesting, not less, who had cleared the room to speak with me alone, who had asked why I walked where his generals kneel, knowing full well the answer was navigational error, and had listened to the truth and called it more interesting anyway. "Why?" I said. Serath folded the remaining bandage material and set it on the table. "He will tell you himself," he said. "He has requested a private audience for tomorrow morning." I looked at my arm. The cut had stopped. The shaking had stopped. I was tired in the specific way that comes after the body has resolved a crisis, a deep bone tiredness that sits below exhaustion and is more honest than it. "The 3 in the corridor," I said. "Who sent them?" "An investigation is underway," Serath said. "You will be informed." "Drevek?" Serath said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I stood up. My legs were steady. That was something. "Thank you," I said. "For the arm." "Thank you," he said, for not running immediately. I thought about it. I know, he stood to. The fact that you thought about it and chose otherwise is exactly what I mean. I did not know how to respond to that. I nodded, which in Vrethian body language meant peer acknowledgement, which I was now fully aware of, and which I used deliberately for the first time since arriving on Vreth Car. He returned it with the same gesture. I walked back to my suite through corridors that were quiet and well lit, with 4 guards behind me, and Sarath walking beside me to the tier entrance. And I thought about tomorrow morning, and what an emperor says to a man he deliberately chose to watch become a legend. I thought I might finally have something to say back. The emperor was already in the room when I arrived, which I had not expected. Every other meeting had required me to wait in a receiving area while appropriate preparations were made, robes arranged, attendants positioned, the full ceremonial apparatus of imperial access assembled. This room had none of that. It was a study, plain by the standards of the station, with shelves of physical documents along one wall, a broad work table covered in papers, and 2 chairs set at an angle to each other, beside a window that showed the slow rotation of a planetary ring in the distance. He was in the second chair. He was wearing a simpler robe than I had seen before, dark gray without decoration, and he had removed whatever structural device usually maintained his hair into its elaborate arrangement, so it hung loosely to his shoulders, which made him look like someone who had been working since before the station lights shifted to morning, and had not stopped for reasons of appearance. He gestured to the first chair. I sat. Your arm, he said. Cleaned and bandaged. I'll be fine. I am told you moved toward the first attacker rather than away. The corridor was narrow, I said. Moving away would have removed my exit options. Yes, he said. He looked at the window for a moment. Most beings move away from an attacker. It is the instinct. You moved toward the threat and used the geometry of the space. I was thinking about freight yards, I said. He turned to look at me. Explain. I told him about freight yards, the way large spaces with contested access teach you to read movement before it becomes action, the way you learn to narrow approaches by positioning rather than speed or strength, the way the structure of a space is always a resource if you read it correctly. I told him the way I would tell any colleague, plainly, with the logic showing. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, You do not perform understanding. You explain it. Performing it takes energy I usually need for something else. Yes, he turned back to the window. I have been emperor for 11 years, he said. In that time, I have received 1,214 formal audiences with beings from 46 civilizations. I have received 11 ambassadors from your species, each of them selected for their rank, their training, their cultural preparation. They arrived with perfect Vrethian honorifics and correct bow angles, and immaculate insignia. They were excellent ambassadors. He paused. I was bored every time. I waited. Then an attendant made a navigation error, he said, and sent me a courier, who had no idea what he had walked into, who addressed me the way you address a person, and not a title, who held his silence because he was thinking, and not because he was managing me, and who told me the truth when the truth was not flattering. He looked at me. When was the last time someone told me the truth simply because it was the truth? Without calculation? Without managing the implications? I thought about this honestly. I don't know, I said. I don't know your court. No, he said. You don't. And that is precisely the point. He leaned forward slightly. The court has grown closed, Doran. 30 years of the same families, the same ranks, the same protocols. Every person who enters this room has spent years learning how to enter this room correctly. They have learned to want the right things, to say the right things, to manage every interaction for the purpose of position. They are very good at it. I can no longer see through them to find out what is actually true. I understood this. I had seen it happen in organizations smaller than an empire, the way the management of appearances becomes the primary activity, and the actual work, the actual problems, the actual truth of what is happening, gets buried under the management. You wanted something that didn't fit the pattern, I said. I needed something that didn't fit the pattern, he said. Something the court could not categorize, could not file into a hierarchy, could not predict. Because they predict everything I do, and everything I do becomes a performance watched and interpreted, and maneuvered around, and I am running an empire from inside a mirror, and I cannot tell anymore what is real. He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table, long-fingered, still, the hands of someone who spent a great deal of time holding documents. The legend that formed around you, he said, was useful. It moved through the court like a question they could not answer, and in trying to answer it they revealed things. Drevak revealed himself. Others watched Drevak. The sealed passage dispute resolved cleanly, for the first time in 9 months, because you treated it as a practical problem rather than a political one, and the guard responded to practical. He looked up. But I did not engineer you, Doran. I only chose not to stop what was already happening. There is a difference. There is, I said. But you let the 3 in the corridor go farther than you needed to. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, that was a mistake. I did not believe Drevak would move so directly. I underestimated his desperation, and you paid for that underestimation. It was the most direct admission I had heard from him. No ceremony around it, no diplomatic cushion. He had made an error and he said so. I found I respected that considerably. Drevak sent them, I said. Yes, he is being dealt with. And Owen Garth, I said. Was he ever coming on this assignment? He held my gaze. Owen Garth is an excellent attaché, he said, which was not an answer to my question in any literal sense but was, I decided, as clear as he was going to be. I sat with that, the inner ear rupture, the 11-minute briefing, the courier, with no rank markers, sent to deliver a case to an emperor. I had wondered, in the background of everything else, whether the coincidence was too clean, whether Petra Hollis's flat reading of the briefing had been practiced flatness, whether the attendant's navigation error had been quite as accidental as it appeared. But then I thought about the pressure gauge, about tapping it twice and watching the needle correct itself, about the things that are actually accidents looking exactly like the things that are not, and the impossibility of knowing which is which from inside the event. Will it matter? I asked. Whether it was planned or not, whether I was chosen or just convenient. He considered this seriously. What matters, he said, is what you decide now. Everything before this moment is history. What happens after it is yours to determine. I looked at the window. The planetary ring was moving slowly, rock and ice rotating in the dark at a speed that felt still from this distance, the way all very large things feel still when you are too close to them. You're going to ask me to stay, I said. I am going to ask you to stay, he confirmed. I thought about the nutrition blocks and the cold diplomatic guest suites and the 11-minute briefing and Petra Hollis, who had not looked up from her screen. I thought about the cargo manifests and the freight yards and the thruster gauge that needed 2 taps. I thought about Sareth walking beside me last night as a peer. I thought about what Sareth had said, that humans could not be categorized, that they found the principle underneath the situation and applied it regardless of whether they knew the situation, and I thought about whether that was actually a compliment or whether it was just a description of what it looks like to do your job without a complete briefing. I said, I have conditions. Something shifted in the Emperor's expression, a quality of attention that focused forward rather than inward. Tell me. I reached into my jacket pocket. I had no paper because I was not the kind of person who carried paper. So I used my reader, which had a cracked screen from the corridor incident, but still functioned, and I opened a note file. First, I said, no more situations where I walk into a crisis without being told it's a crisis. I need actual briefings. Full ones. Not ceremonially constructed fragments. Agreed. Second, Asa stays as my translator. Full-time. Adequately compensated. Agreed. Third, someone explains Vrethian protocol to me before I walk into it, not after I've already caused an incident. A cultural liaison will be assigned permanently. Fourth, I said, and I looked up from the reader. I file my own reports, to my own chain of command. I remain a Terran Diplomatic Corps officer. I am not a Vrethian court official, and I am not going to become one. He was quiet for a moment. You may retain your Corps affiliation. And fifth, I said, someone tells me where I can get coffee on this station. The pressed grain drink is acceptable, but it is not coffee. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time since I had arrived on Vreth-Kar, the Emperor of the Vrethian Imperium laughed. It was a brief sound, not loud, but completely unmanaged. The laugh of a person caught off guard by something that is genuinely funny, and it made him look 11 years younger and entirely human, which was probably not the description he would have chosen. I will have someone locate your coffee, he said. Thank you, I said. He stood. I stood. He walked to a cabinet along one wall and removed a small flat box and brought it to me. Inside was a piece of metal on a short pin, simple in shape, a single geometric form that I did not recognize from any Vrethian insignia system I had studied. This was made 3 days ago, he said, when I decided I would ask you to stay regardless of what happened next. I looked at it. What does it mean? It is a new rank, he said. There was no existing designation for the position. We created one. He paused. It translates, roughly, as unmarked counsel. I looked at him. Which means exactly what it says. Which means exactly what it says, he agreed. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected, small and plain against my palm. A rank that had not existed until someone decided it should, built around a person who had walked in through the wrong door and told the truth and refused to perform understanding he did not have. I turned it over once and then pinned it to my jacket, next to the torn collar seam from the night before. It did not look like much. It was also, I thought, the most honest thing anyone had given me in a long time. I thanked the Emperor. I walked to the door. He spoke once more before I opened it. Doran. I turned. Owen Garth would have done the job correctly, he said. You did something else. I am not certain I can tell you what, exactly, but I am grateful for the difference. I thought about the pressure gauge, about tapping it twice, about the needle jumping back to normal, not because the gauge was fixed, not because the problem was gone, but because sometimes the right intervention is just the right pressure in exactly the right place. Tell the attendants, I said, that reassigning them was excessive. They should have their regular posts back. He looked at me for a moment. I will consider it. Thank you, I said, and opened the door. The 2 guards in the corridor outside fell into their standard positions, half a step behind and to either side. I walked down the corridor toward the suite I had been given, where I needed to write a mission report that was going to be the strangest document I had ever filed, and after that I needed to find Osa and explain that her role had just changed significantly, and after that I needed to review the ongoing boundary materials from the sealed passage case, because I had resolved it without reading the original documents, and that was the kind of shortcut that created problems later. I pulled out my reader as I walked, and opened a new document. At the top I typed, Promotion acquired. Assignment status changed. Send new parameters. Also, someone in Terran Diplomatic Corps Logistics needs to know that the pressed grain drink on Vreth-Kar is sufficient, but coffee would be advisable for extended postings. I will file a full recommendation. I paused. The Emperor of the Vrethian Imperium is capable of finding things funny, which is not noted in any briefing I have seen, and should be added to the cultural profile. I kept walking. Behind me, boot steps followed in measured rhythm. In my jacket pocket, next to the folded notes of an old manifest commendation and a cultural liaison's translation cards, a small plain piece of metal sat against the lining, warm from my hand. Unmarked counsel. It meant exactly what it said, and for the first time since arriving on Vreth-Kar, I thought that might be enough.